Hello. Last time in our study of John's Gospel, we looked at chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And we noted, first of all, that verse connects back to the Genesis account of creation by starting with those key words, in the beginning. Now, what I want you to see as he goes down into the 14th verse, which we looked at last time, he says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, or took up residence among us, or as Peterson puts it in the Message, moved in to the neighborhood. First of all, I want you to see that these things that John is saying about Jesus, whom he calls the Logos or the Word, and later we'll call the Son of God, these things are his conclusions. Now, these verses at the beginning of chapter 1 are an introduction to the book, but actually they are his conclusions. John spent all that time with Jesus when he lived among us, and then went on to, after Jesus left this world, he went on to spend decades serving Christ in the world. And now, as he writes this late in his life, these are his mature conclusions about Jesus. Now, he'll authenticate these conclusions in what follows in the Gospel of John, just as these things were authenticated in the other three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, I want you to notice a key word in chapter 1, verse 14. After he says he took up residence among us, he says, we observed his glory. The glory as the one and only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, we noted that in the first verse of this chapter, John had been tying his message to the Genesis creation story. But now, as he moves on to refer to Jesus' glory, he is alluding now to the story of Moses and the Exodus and the people of Israel after they left Egypt. Let me take you back to a key text in that story, which is the 33rd chapter of Exodus. There's been some trouble, and Moses is deeply concerned about himself and his people and their relationship to God as they move from Egypt to the Promised Land. And so Moses in chapter 33, verse 18 says, please, let me see your glory. That's his prayer to God the Father. Let me see your glory. And so God says to him, I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim the name Yahweh before you. Usually translated the Lord in English translations. I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. But he answered, you cannot see my face, for no one can see my face and live. And that famous story goes on to say that God would place Moses in the cleft of the rock. He would pass by, but he would cover his eyes until he had passed by, so that Moses could only see his backside. A mysterious story indeed, but the emphasis is on the glory of God is so great that no one can see that glory directly and without filters, as it were, and live. So, that's the story that John is alluding to when he says of Jesus, we have seen his glory. And he will keep emphasizing that throughout the Gospel of John. This is a word, glory, that will appear regularly within John's Gospel. But I want to move you forward to something the Apostle Paul says, because I want you to see how the Scriptures interpret themselves and how the message of Christ in the Gospel from John is consistent with what will also be preached by the other apostles, including that late apostle Paul. So I turn your attention to 2 Corinthians 4, where Paul says in verse 6, for God who said, let light shine out of darkness, has shone in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. You see how Paul has alluded, like John, to both the creation story, let light shine out of darkness, and also to the Moses story where God hid his face. But now Paul picks up on that and says, yes, but now we've seen God's glory in the face of the incarnate Son, even the Lord Jesus Christ. May He bless you, and until next time, may the glory of God occupy your thoughts.